Hello and welcome. You are listening to On Show, the Louvre Abu Dhabi podcast that takes you on a tour. I am your host, Botton, and today we're stepping inside the exhibition Picasso, the Figure, with Aisha al Ahmadi, the exhibition Associate Curator. Together, we explore Pablo Picasso's lifelong fascination with the human form and his ability to continuously integrate new influences to nourish his creative endeavours. Join us as we walk through this exceptional show, uncovering Picasso's sources of influence and his dialogue with the rich currents of Arab modernism. Hello Aisha, thank you for taking us on this tour today. We are in the exhibition Picasso, the Figure at Louvre Abu Dhabi. And to start off, let's talk about what makes it so special at Louvre Abu Dhabi and for the regional visitors.
Thank you for having me. And this exhibition is special for a number of reasons. The first being that it's the first monographic exhibition at the Louvre Abu Dhabi.
So for one artist only?
Exactly. So we, of course, included artists that influenced him and were influenced by him, but it's focused predominantly on one of the biggest names in art history to this day, Pablo Picasso.
And on the figure?
Yes, the figure throughout different decades of his career.
And what's really interesting to me as well is how in the exhibition there's also a cross-cultural dialogue with regional artists.
Yes, so as I just mentioned, we've included artists that have influenced Picasso and were influenced by him. So you'll notice that in almost every section of the exhibition, there is a regional voice that was in contact with Picasso, either worked directly with him, like Baya, who we'll talk about a little bit more, or was inspired by him and included him in the group's manifesto, like Jawad Salim.
Can you tell us about the exhibition structure?
So it's divided into 6 rooms, and with each room, almost, there is a Greek myth linked to Picasso's work. And we're following a chronological and thematic approach.
This connection to myth that we will evoke along the way, why is that?
Because Greek mythology was big for Picasso himself, and because we wanted to do a new approach on Picasso. Of course, there have been many exhibitions on Picasso, so what makes this one different? It's the narrative approach through Greek mythology and the encompassing and display of regional artists in dialogue with Picasso's work.
So it's a new layer of interpretation of his work.
Exactly.
All right, so as we step in the first section, titled Orient, the Figure as Sign, we're quite early in Picasso's career. As you said, we're in a chronological approach, more or less. Mm-hmm. What does this section reveal about Picasso's early experiment?
So as we mentioned, it's Orion. It's one of the myths. So it's about the hunter, great giant hunter that was shot down because he became too arrogant. And then he was turned into a constellation of stars. So this is similar to Picasso's work at this time, where he would take a human figure and break it down and turn it into symbols or signs. So this, we're thinking of 1906 in Gossel, where he was inspired by the early Catalan polychrome sculptures. So he started experimenting with wood carvings. And we're also looking at the influence in 1907, his first encounter with African art, and how even though he didn't completely understand African art, he knew that it held something sacred, magical, that it was a mediator between the people and the forces that are beyond the people. And so this pushed him to essentially push the figure to new realms. So the face becomes a mask. He starts to venture into analytical cubism, 1911.
Yeah, this section is quite striking because the figure is completely constructed.
Exactly. So you even see the Louvre Abu Dhabi work, 1911, Woman with a Mandolin. You cannot really tell where the woman starts, where the music instrument starts. You can sort of discern an ear, maybe, but it's no longer clear.
And so from these very radical beginnings and experimentation, the next section is quite different. And to tease a little bit, visitors might be a bit surprised maybe by what we see in section 2, Pygmalion, the classical figure. So Picasso returned to classicism after cubism, as you said. Why this shift, and where are we in terms of his career?
We're after World War I.
Okay.
So Picasso goes back to classicism. It's, like you mentioned, something that might be a shock for some people because we're used to Picasso in shapes and colors, and then here you have very classical portraits that resemble Ingres, which was a great source of influence. So you would see that we've set a portrait of Picasso, Mrs. Rosenberg, against a portrait by Ingres, and you can really see the similarities between the two, in the posture, in the eyes. And this is because at that time he had gone to Italy. He was inspired by the classical figures that he encountered there, and he had also married in 1917 Olga, who was the Russian ballet dancer, and she immersed him into high-class Paris.
All right.
So now he was drawing some of his close friends, some of her family, and a lot of portraits of Olga herself.
Okay, and we find a few in that section of the exhibition.
Some paintings, some drawings.
What about the regional voice represented in this section?
So in this section, alongside the classical portraits, we also have some ceramics by Picasso, which he did during his time in Valrus.
What's super interesting about Picasso is actually the variety of media that he explored. I mean, we will talk about his different styles, but also thinking of Picasso, maybe what comes to mind is painting, but here we see ceramics,
drawings.
You talked about woodwork.
You're going to see some interesting things like tapestry, some things that you might not usually think of Picasso. So this exhibition has really a wide variety of mediums. And this was also made possible because we've collaborated with the National Museum Picasso in Paris, who has the largest collection of his works in the world. And it's the most comprehensive collection as well. So we're thinking around 5,000 works, over 200,000 archival materials, covering everything. So we were able to encompass some of these into the exhibition.
So coming back to Baya, what can you tell me about her?
So as I was mentioning, Baya's work is set in dialogue with Picasso's ceramics. So Baya was very young when she first went to Paris in 1947. She was 16 or 17, and she had her first solo exhibition there. And amazingly, she was able to get the attention of Picasso and other avant-garde artists because she was creating these dreamlike, colorful, unconstrained figures, female figures, and they were just enchanted by her work. And so eventually she gets invited to the Medora Pottery Studio.
In the south of France? Right?
Yes, exactly. And she works alongside Picasso for a few summers, creating ceramics, very colorful ones, as the one you can see here. So we've put the two in dialogue because it's believed that Baya also could have influenced or been one of the sources of influence for Picasso's Women of Algiers series, and to have given him a new perspective. Because if you know Picasso, you know he was very much in love with this idea of childlike art, which Baya seems to have encapsulated perfectly. This freedom to express without constraint, and she was drawing from the colors of her country, from Islamic traditions, from the Amazigh. So she was really rooted in her hometown.
Next, we enter the realm of the Minotaur. It's a mythical creature that really fascinated Picasso. So why did it become a recurring figure in his work?
For a number of reasons. I think his trip to Italy in 1917, he encountered and visited museums and archaeological sites, and he discovered the frescoes of Pompeii. And on them, there were numerous mythological figures. But specifically, the Minotaur resonated with him because he had Spanish roots. He thought the bull was the most proud symbol of all, and the bullfights were a ritual for him. He would go with his family, he would plan it well in advance, he would arrive earlier than the fights, get to greet the members and everything. He was very immersed, and you'd see photographs of him taking his son Claude at a very young age. So it was a family trip, and friends were also invited.
There's actually a picture also in the exhibition of Picasso wearing a face of bull, right?
Yes, because he really seemed to identify with the Minotaur, this defiant, sometimes angry, sometimes just full of emotions, half bull, half human figure.
So the next section is called the petrified figure, and it's a new form of exploration there that we find by Picasso. We're roughly in the 1930s, and what's interesting is also the dialogue that we find there between Picasso and a new set of influence, for instance, prehistorical finds and figurines that he collected as well. It's quite actually interesting to see that the emergence of prehistorical studies happens at the moment where there's so many modernist experiments. And we also see a dialogue with the original artist, Jawad Salim.
Yes, so as you mentioned, we've done actually a pretty interesting display. We've tried to recreate the display that, or the vitrine that Picasso would have in his studio. So you have a wallpaper photograph of that vitrine and the little statue replicas of what would have been in there. So we've talked a bit about the influences that he tapped into, so his time in Italy, Ingres, classicism, and also prehistory, as you mentioned. And you'll also notice the influence of non-Western art is also present. Right. So in the podium, you can see a Nimba mask, which is something that Picasso had in his collection. This is the large African mask which used to be worn as an initiation ritual. So it comes from the Louvre Abu Dhabi collection. So you see that these sources of influences led to what are known as the magical paintings. That paired with the ideas of that time, so Freud's ideas that Picasso was immersed in as well, led to these series of magical paintings. And then also we have in this room the Bathers series. These are, I would say, the two most notable divisions in this room. And then you had, as you mentioned, we have the Jawad Salim, who was born in Turkey to Iraqi parents, and he returned to the country as a young child, and he's regarded today as one of the greatest Iraqi artists. So Jawad, alongside with Shakir Hassan al-Sayyid, his colleague and friend, founded the Baghdad Modern Art Group. And in their manifesto, they quoted Picasso's work and saw that his approach was revolutionary, but the foundation of their manifesto and their movement was that no matter how much we look outside to the avant-garde, to the Europe, to the West, we should always remain rooted in our country and in our traditions. So you see for example, in this section, the painting Women Selling Material from Berjil. So the subject matter is very much Iraqi rooted, a vendor you would see in the streets, but the treatment of the subject matter is very much drawn from Picasso's visual language. So you see the intersection between the two.
And the next section, Aisha, is a highlight of the exhibition.
So
we are entering a room called Beyond Guernica in reference to the very famous work by Picasso. But the work that we see right in front of us is by an Iraqi artist, Aisha al Ahmadi.
Yes.
And there's a very strong dialogue set up in that space. Can you tell us more about that? What is the reasoning behind, and also talking about the sound that we hear behind us, because we hear a poem being read, and it's also very much part of this display.
So we're standing in front of the largest painting in the exhibition. It's made up of 4 panels, created in 2011 by Aisha al Ahmadi. So this work draws parallels to Guernica, both in subject matter and visually. You can directly see as soon as you look at the work. The grayscale, it belongs to a series titled Land of Darkness that the Aisha al Ahmadi created as a commentary to the loss that Iraq has endured and continues to endure. And unlike his usual paintings, they're very vibrant, they're very colorful. Here we see it's devoid of color, it's on grayscale, which mimics Guernica's color palette as well. And also in terms of visual language, you see the disembodied horses, horse parts, human hands, you see a tank, the wheels of a tank. It's not very clear, but the more you look at it, the more things start to pop at you. A sword, half a sword, looking like it's going into someone. And similarly, you can look at a projection of photographs by Dora Maar, taken in Picasso's studio, sort of like a time lapse of that time.
Yeah.
The equivalent of a time lapse. So
she documented
exactly
the making of Guernica.
Yes, and you can see that projected and set next to the Aisha al Ahmadi so that you can really look at the two pieces in dialogue and see the parallels between them. And both speak of destruction. So Guernica was a response to the bombing of the city, and then the Aisha al Ahmadi's work was a response to the destruction of Iraq.
And so it's also a dialogue in time, let's say,
exactly.
Looking at global history and a response almost an activist response
Yes.
to an act of war.
Exactly. In different times, but the topic remains the same and remains relevant to this day. And then, as you mentioned, there's the sound that you can hear in the room. So Lia Azawi's work is Elegy to My Trapped City. And then the poem playing is Elegy to My Unborn City by also Abdul Wahab al-Bayati, who is also an Iraqi poet.
Okay.
So you'd notice that Lia Azawi's work often draws from Mahmoud Darwish, for example, or very well-known poets, either in terms of inspiration for the content of the painting or more so the title of the works. So we can hear the voice of a local poet reciting in the room. So it really creates a sort of immersive experience.
Finally, we arrive at Picasso's late years with the last section of the exhibition. It's called the Picasso Canon. And as we move through the exhibition, we might have been surprised by, for instance, his very radical experiments in Cubism or classical, on the other hand. But there's something about Picasso that is, whenever we see a work by Picasso, usually we can tell.
Exactly. You can instantly know that this is a Picasso.
Yeah, and now we're looking at works from 1945 to 1973, which is, I think, when he passed.
Yes, he died in 1973. And like you mentioned, it's called Picasso Canon because unlike the previous sections, there is no Greek myth here. Picasso's work becomes the myth, he becomes the legend. It becomes so that the work is instantly recognizable as a Picasso. He successfully created a visual language that is so unique and so easily identifiable as his own. So you can see here, as you mentioned again, that these are some of his later works, and there are the themes that remain relevant with him until he dies. So some themes you've seen earlier in the exhibition.
Like portraits, a lot of portraits.
A lot of portraits. He loved portraits, and specifically the double viewpoint portraits. So you'd see as if you're looking at two faces.
Merged in one.
Yes, merged together.
And there's an exceptional display actually of these works on one full wall. We see many paintings side to side. So it really creates this
grand
feeling, and also the sensation of abundance. Like also he was a very prolific artist.
He was up until his death. He was creating in crazy amounts. He just wanted to create, like when you have the last burst of energy. He had that. He had like a strong burst of energy to create, and they're very vibrant, these works as well. And they're, as I mentioned, enduring themes. So one of them we said the portraits, also the woman in the armchair. So if you remember earlier, we saw Olga in an armchair a lot. And now we see here that this theme is still present. Also the theme of the musketeers, he was exploring a lot towards the end of his career.
Okay. And we see that he explores this in various formats, because in this room we see also the two biggest formats after the Azawi of the exhibition.
Yeah.
Through tapestries.
Exactly. And again, this is something you might not usually think when you think of Picasso. You wouldn't think he was doing tapestry. But he really dabbled in everything. He explored. And that's something he loved to do. He loved to explore and push mediums, even when they frustrated him. So ceramics really, for example, frustrated him for a long time of his career, but he still was stubborn and tried to push it into new realms. He would deal with many people, and here he would deal with people who made tapestry. And this is said to be the only time that he made the drawing for a tapestry. So in which the drawing was then set behind the wrap threads on the loom, so that the weaver could precisely follow the composition, patterns, and colors desired by the artist in the weaving process. And it took a long time to create. So the drawing was done, but the weaving process maybe started 30 years after.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, so some of these were created even after his death.
All right. And what can you tell us about this room and the expressive freedom of Picasso in dialogue with the regional voices that we've explored in Arab modernism?
So we have in this section two regional artists. We have Samir Rafi, who belonged for a while to the Surrealist art collective Art and Liberty. And then we have Shakir Hassan al-Sayed, who I've already mentioned. He worked alongside Jawad Salim in the Modern Baghdad art group. And Samir Rafi, for example, since we haven't spoken about him yet, he was also influenced by Pablo Picasso, by the architect Le Corbusier, and these connections, when he studied in Paris as well, a lot of these regional artists had some time in Paris. So while he was there and he was studying, he encountered the works of some of these well-known artists and took, again, certain elements, be it the visual language, be it the color. So here you can see some very bright, vibrant colors, and then the approach to the figure that mimics Picasso's visual language.
So for all of these reasons, for the richness of the exhibition and this dialogue, it's really an exhibition not to be missed.
Exactly.
Aisha, what would you like, or what would you hope for a visitor to take away from this exhibition?
So I think to really enjoy, Picasso liked to enjoy the art. He looked at it, as I mentioned, with a childlike wonder, to enjoy the evolution of the figure from the different sources of influences to the different mediums that he used, and to also understand the broader art history narrative with the inclusion of either Western influences or regional artists, and how the story is never as clean cut or small as we think. It's much broader. That's why I love art history. It's always so much broader.
Thank you so much, Aisha, for your time.
Thank you for having me.
This was an episode of On Show, the Louvre Abu Dhabi podcast that takes you on a tour. The exhibition Picasso the Figure is on show at the Louvre Abu Dhabi from the 21st January to the 31st of May 2026. On Show is available on all your favorite podcast platforms in Arabic, English and French. If you'd like to learn more about our exhibitions, simply subscribe to the Louvre Abu Dhabi channel and explore our past episodes. And if you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and give us a 5-star rating. On Show is a podcast produced by the Louvre Abu Dhabi. Executive producers Amine Kharchach and Botton. Post-production music and mixing by Making Waves. Our warm thanks go to our guest Aisha al Ahmadi for her kind participation. Thank you for listening and stay tuned for our next episodes.